In March 2024, an ordinary cardboard box sat among hundreds of other items at an estate auction in Richmond, Virginia. Inside that box was a photograph that would reveal a family secret hidden for more than 100 years. Lot 47 miscellaneous photographs and documents from around 1880 to 1920. The winning bid was $35. The image showed 4 people posed in a nice photography studio. A man and woman sat in formal poses, with their 2 young children standing beside them. The photograph was dated 1889 on the studio's embossed label, Levine Studios, 147 Royal Street, New Orleans, Louisiana. At first look, it seemed like a usual late Victorian family portrait, but several details made it stand out. The man's skin tone was clearly darker than his wife's. The children looked even lighter than their mother. In 1889 New Orleans, this mix told a clear story. This was a mixed-race Creole family, part of the city's complex racial setup that existed for a short time between the end of slavery and the start of Jim Crow laws. Dr. Rebecca Walsh, a historian who studies post-Reconstruction Southern communities, bought the box and brought the photograph to Georgetown University's digital imaging lab. What she hoped to find was basic facts about the family's identity. What she actually found would lead to one of the most remarkable genealogy studies in recent American history. When the photograph was scanned at 50 times magnification, tiny text became visible along the bottom edge. The words were written in elegant French script, so small they would have needed a jeweler's magnifying glass to write, "May our children be free." But that was not the only hidden message. Enhanced imaging showed that the man's hand, pressed against his vest, was placed over what looked like a hard object under the fabric. The pressure created clear marks that, when magnified, showed a date, September 15, 1889. Researchers checked this date against historical records. 15 days after this photograph was taken, Louisiana would hold a constitutional convention that would take away voting rights from black citizens and bring in a time of harsh segregation. 2 weeks after that convention, the man in the photograph, later identified as Antoine Dubois, would disappear from all historical records. His wife and children would vanish too. But unlike Antoine, they would come back with new names, new identities, and, most important, a new race. The family had made a choice that would echo through 5 generations, and in 2024, that choice would finally be brought to light. Levine Studios was in a modest building on Royal Street in New Orleans, French Quarter, during the 1880s and 1890s. The studio was unusual for its time. Owner Jean-Baptiste Levine openly offered his services to free people of color in a city where most white-owned businesses refused to serve black or mixed-race clients. Historical records show that Levine's customers included New Orleans' special Creole community, people of mixed African, French, and Spanish background, who held a complex middle place in the city's racial order. Some were wealthy, educated, and owned property. Many spoke French as their first language. During Reconstruction, some had even held public office. But by 1889, that world was falling apart. White supremacist groups were gaining political power across the South. States were putting in new laws to separate and take rights from black citizens. Louisiana's Constitutional Convention was set for late September 1889, and everyone knew what was coming: the end of whatever weak racial tolerance had existed. The Dubois family's decision to visit Levine Studios in mid-September was not by chance. Research into the studio's ledgers, kept at the historic New Orleans collection, showed that Levine charged different prices for different kinds of portraits. A standard family sitting cost $2, but for $5, Levine offered what he quietly called a documentation service: high-quality portraits with extra copies and careful preservation. The Dubois family paid $7, a big amount in 1889, equal to about $200 today. The extra cost included something special: microscopic engraving on the photograph itself, a service Levine gave to clients who wanted to hide messages that could only be read with magnification. Why would a family need to hide a message in their own portrait? The answer lay in what was about to happen. The Louisiana Constitutional Convention of 1898 would put in grandfather clauses, literacy tests, and poll taxes that basically ended black voting rights. It would also enforce strict segregation laws and ban interracial marriage. Mixed-race families like the Dubois family were about to become illegal. The photograph, researchers now understand, was proof. Antoine and Celeste Dubois were making a record of their family's existence before the family was forced to stop existing. The hidden message, "May our children be free," was not just a wish. It was a goodbye. The family that sat for this portrait in September 1889 would never be together again. Within weeks, they would make a choice that millions of American families faced: give up their identity or give up their safety. They could not have both. Modern digital imaging technology has changed historical research. What was invisible to past generations of historians can now be seen with special scanning, equipment, and image analysis software. When the Dubois photograph went through high-resolution scanning at Georgetown University, the process captured details at a microscopic level. Each square inch of the original photograph was divided into thousands of digital pixels, letting researchers look at areas that would be impossible to see with the naked eye. The French inscription along the bottom edge was the first find, but it was not the last. Dr. Martin Chen, the imaging specialist doing the analysis, noticed unusual patterns in other parts of the photograph. The mother's hand, resting on her daughter's shoulder, wore a special ring. When magnified, the ring's design became clear. An unusual compass rose, with what looked like numbers engraved around its edge. Further enhancement showed these were geographic coordinates: 29,951 N, 90,071 W. Those coordinates pointed to a specific spot in New Orleans, a property in the Treme neighborhood, one of the oldest African-American communities in the United States. Property records from 1889 showed the land was owned by Antoine Dubois, the man in the photograph. But the most important discovery came from looking at the photographic backdrop itself. Victorian photographers used painted backgrounds to give portraits an elegant look. The Levine Studios backdrop showed classical columns and draped fabric, usual for the time. But high magnification scanning revealed something hidden in the painted drapery. Extremely faint writing, visible only because the paint had aged differently over the text. The words were instructions: certificate of free birth, fourth drawer behind the saint medal. This secret message seemed to point to a place where important papers were hidden. In the 19th century South, certificates of free birth were legal papers, proving that a person of African descent had been born free, not enslaved. These certificates were valuable. They could mean the difference between freedom and slavery, between having legal rights and having none. The message suggested that Antoine and Celeste had hidden their families' documents somewhere specific. But why put these directions in a photograph? Researchers realized the photograph served many purposes. It was a family portrait, yes, but it was also a map, a message, and a legal record, all hidden in an image that looked ordinary to regular viewers. The Dubois family was getting ready for a future where they might need to prove who they were, where they came from, and what they had lost. They were making evidence that could last even if they could not stay together. Tracing what happened to Antoine Dubois after September 1889 took a lot of archival research across several states. The trail started with New Orleans city records, where Antoine disappeared from the city directory after October 1889. Property records showed he transferred ownership of his Treme property to his wife Celeste in late October, an unusual step at a time when married women rarely held property in their own names. Then came a gap. For 3 months, no records of Antoine Dubois existed anywhere. He had vanished. In January 1890, a man named Anthony Dubois appeared in employment records for the Southern Texas, working as a porter. The records listed him as colored and noted he had recently arrived from Louisiana. This matched the timeline of Antoine's disappearance. Census records from 1900 confirmed this was the same man. Anthony Dubois, age 42, birthplace Louisiana, living in a segregated black neighborhood in Houston. He had remarried a black woman named Sarah Washington. They had 3 children. Letters kept by Sarah's descendants revealed the emotional cost of Antoine's choice. In one letter to a friend in New Orleans, written in 1892, Sarah wrote, "My husband carries a great sadness. He had a family before me, but won't speak their names. Sometimes I hear him crying at night." Another letter from 1898 was more direct. "Anthony showed me a photograph yesterday, a woman and 2 children. He says they're in a better place now, where they'll have opportunities he could never give them. He says he did the right thing, but the right thing is killing him." The photograph Sarah mentioned had to be the 1889 Levine Studios portrait. Antoine had kept a copy hidden among his things, a reminder of the family he had given up everything to protect. Antoine Dubois died in Houston in 1924 at age 66. His death certificate listed his occupation as railroad porter, his race as Negro, and his marital status as married to Sarah Dubois. Under children, it listed only the 3 children he had with Sarah. His first family, Marie and Thomas, were not mentioned. Legally, historically, officially, they no longer existed as his children. The color line he could not cross had erased them from his life. But the photograph remained, hidden proof of a family that law and society had said was impossible. Antoine had chosen their freedom over his own happiness. He died without ever seeing them again. While Antoine Dubois disappeared into the segregated black communities of Texas, his wife and children carried out a carefully planned change. In December 1889, 3 months after the family photograph was taken, a woman named Celeste Beaumont appeared in Mobile, Alabama city records. She listed herself as a widow with 2 children, Marie and Thomas. Her listed race, white. The name change was small but meaningful. Celeste Dubois became Celeste Beaumont. French Creole became French aristocratic. Mixed race became white. The change needed more than just a new name. It needed documents, references, and most important, belief. Church records from Mobile's Sacred Heart Catholic Church show the Beaumont family's arrival. Father Michael O'Connor, the parish priest, noted in his records that Mrs. Beaumont presented proper letters of introduction from New Orleans, though strangely, no specific church was named. She enrolled her children in the parish school, gave generously to the church, and quickly became part of Mobile's white Catholic community. How did she get these proper letters? Research suggests Celeste had help. New Orleans in the 1880s had a network of Creole families who helped those trying to pass into white society. Some Catholic priests, especially those with French or Spanish backgrounds, were known to provide documents that hid racial heritage. For families like the Dubois, with light skin, French language skills, Catholic faith, and enough money, crossing the color line was hard but possible. The children's school records give a look at how completely Celeste rebuilt their identities. Marie and Thomas were enrolled as having recently arrived from Paris, France, with their widowed mother. Their previous education in New Orleans was described as private tutoring by French governesses. This story explained any gaps in their papers while adding an aristocratic touch that stopped too many questions. By 1895, Celeste had remarried. Her new husband, Harold Whitmore, was a white merchant who owned a successful import business. The marriage certificate listed Celeste's race as white, her birthplace as New Orleans, her parents as deceased French immigrants. The children took the Whitmore surname. Marie Dubois became Marie Whitmore. Thomas Dubois became Thomas Whitmore. Their father, Antoine, was erased from official records, replaced in the family story by a made-up French aristocrat who had died tragically, leaving Celeste a young, beautiful widow. The Beaumont identity had been temporary, a transition stage. The Whitmore identity would last. Through this second marriage, Celeste secured her children's future in white America. The cost was everything they had been. The benefit was everything they could become. By 1920, the split between Antoine's descendants and Celeste's descendants showed the clear reality of racial division in early 20th century America. In Houston, Antoine's children with Sarah, James, Robert, and Dorothy grew up in Houston's 4th Ward, a segregated black neighborhood. They attended colored school number 2, where resources were only a fraction of what white schools received. James became a railroad porter like his father. Robert worked in a segregated hospital as a janitor, even though he had finished nurse training. Texas law stopped black nurses from treating white patients. Dorothy became a school teacher in the colored school system, earning about half what white teachers made. Meanwhile, in Mobile and later Atlanta, Marie and Thomas Whitmore attended well-funded white schools. Marie graduated from a private women's academy and married a banker. Thomas attended Auburn University, then worked in his stepfather's import business before starting his own company. By 1920, Thomas Whitmore owned property, voted in elections, and served on the city council. His sister, Marie, hosted charity events and joined exclusive women's clubs. Same genetic background, same parents, completely different Americas. Census records from 1920 show this division with numbers. Antoine's Houston descendants lived in neighborhoods where the average home value was $800, where 60% of adults had no formal education beyond primary school, where average life expectancy was 48 years. Celeste's descendants lived where average home value was $4,500, where 80% of adults had high school education or more, where average life expectancy was 63 years. The gap was not just economic. It was about life itself. Antoine's grandchildren grew up with colored-only water fountains, separate entrances to buildings, and the constant threat of violence for breaking racial rules. Celeste's grandchildren grew up with access, opportunity, and the safety of whiteness. Letters from this time kept in both family lines show an interesting pattern. Neither family talked about the past. Antoine's descendants knew their grandfather had lost a family, but were never told details. When asked, Antoine would say, only, "They went to a better place. Don't ask me more." Celeste's descendants were told their grandmother was French Creole from New Orleans, but details were vague. When pressed, Celeste would say, "That world is gone now. We are Whitmores." Both families were carrying secrets. Both had learned that survival required forgetting. But the 1889 photograph existed, buried in an estate sale box, waiting to show what everyone had worked so hard to hide. The past, it turned out, was not as buried as they believed. When Dr. Rebecca Walsh published her early findings about the Dubois photograph in the Journal of Southern History in September 2024, she had no idea her research would reach the descendants themselves. The article, titled Hidden Messages in Late Victorian Photography, a case study from New Orleans, included the enhanced image of the Dubois family, along with Walsh's analysis of the hidden writings, and the family's apparent decision to separate along racial lines. The journal had modest circulation, mostly academic readers. Walsh expected perhaps a few fellow historians would find it interesting. Instead, 2 readers found it personally shocking. Margaret Beaumont, a 58-year-old civil rights attorney in Charleston, South Carolina, saw the article shared on a genealogy forum. She immediately recognized the name Celeste Beaumont, her great-great-grandmother. Family history said Celeste was a French Creole widow who had married Harold Whitmore in Mobile. Margaret had always been proud of her Creole heritage, the French language traditions, the Catholic faith passed through generations. But the photograph Walsh published showed something Margaret's family had never mentioned: Celeste's first husband, and he was clearly black. At almost the same time, James Mitchell, a 62-year-old Baptist minister in Atlanta, Georgia, saw the same article shared in a group dedicated to African American genealogy. His family oral history included stories about his great-grandfather, Antoine, who had lost his first family under mysterious circumstances. James had assumed his great-grandfather's first wife and children had died, perhaps in childbirth or an epidemic, common tragedies in the 1880s. But the photograph showed they had been alive, and the article explained they had crossed the color line. Both Margaret and James contacted Dr. Chations, Neither knew about the other's message. Walsh found herself facing an ethical dilemma she had expected, but hoped to avoid. Should she connect these descendants? Margaret Beaumont's DNA test results, done after reading Walsh's article, showed 18% African ancestry. James Mitchell's results showed 12% European ancestry. The genetic evidence confirmed what the photograph and documents suggested. They were cousins, same great-great-grandparents, same genetic background. But Margaret had grown up white in white neighborhoods, attending white schools, benefiting from white privilege. James had grown up black, facing segregation, discrimination, and the ongoing effects of systemic racism. They shared blood, but had lived entirely different American experiences. And now they had to decide. Did they want to meet? Could they bring together their family's past with their present identities? Was truth more important than the comfort of not knowing? Dr. Walsh sent both of them a message, including the other's contact information. Then she waited to see if 135 years of separation could be bridged. Margaret Beaumont and James Mitchell agreed to meet in New Orleans, the city where their shared ancestors had made their impossible choice 135 years earlier. Dr. Walsh arranged the meeting at the former location of Levine Studios on Royal Street. The building now held a restaurant, but the second floor remained mostly unchanged from 1889. The owner, aware of the historical importance, allowed them to use the space. Margaret arrived first, with her daughter Claire, a documentary filmmaker, who insisted on recording the meeting. James arrived minutes later with his son David, a high school history teacher. The four stood awkwardly in the room where their great-great-grandparents had once posed for a photograph that would trouble their descendants more than a century later. "I don't know what to say," Margaret began. "I have spent my entire life believing I knew who I was, who my family was, and now," James nodded, "my grandfather Antoine died when my father was young. We knew he'd had sadness in his life, but we thought it was about people who died. We didn't know they were alive, just living as white people." The conversation that followed lasted 4 hours. Dr. Walsh, present as a moderator and historian, recorded it for her research. The transcript shows the complexity of their reactions. Margaret expressed anger at the deception, grief for the loss of her true heritage, and confusion about her own identity. "I've practiced civil rights law for 30 years, she said at one point. "I fought housing discrimination, voter suppression, police violence against black communities, and the whole time I was benefiting from a choice my ancestor made to abandon her blackness. How do I reconcile that?" James spoke about the burden his family had carried. Antoine worked himself to death as a railroad porter. His children, my grandfather, and great-aunts, faced Jim Crow, segregation, violence. They couldn't vote, couldn't get fair wages, couldn't protect themselves from discrimination, all while their half-siblings or cousins lived as white people with access to everything. That anger doesn't go away just because we're all family. But there were also moments of connection. When Margaret showed photos of her grandmother, James immediately saw the resemblance to his own grandmother. Both women had inherited Celeste's distinctive cheekbones and eyes. When James shared stories about Antoine's love of music, Margaret revealed that her family had similar traditions. French songs passed down through generations. They were strangers, but they were also family. And somehow they had to figure out what that meant. The meeting in New Orleans was only the beginning. In the months that followed, Margaret Beaumont and James Mitchell each faced hard reckonings within their own families and communities. For Margaret, the revelation meant rethinking her entire identity. She had always identified as white, with Creole heritage, adding a cultural touch, but not changing her racial classification. Learning that her great-great-grandfather was black, that her ancestor had deliberately hidden this heritage, forced her to face difficult questions about privilege and complicity. Her work as a civil rights attorney took on new meaning and new complications. When she shared her family history during a community forum on reparations, the reaction was mixed. Some praised her honesty and saw her story as showing the made-up nature of racial categories. Others questioned whether she had any right to speak on issues affecting Black communities when her family had chosen to leave that identity. Her daughter Claire's documentary about their family discovery became a point of debate. Some viewers saw it as a strong look at how racial categories had destroyed families. Others criticized it as centering a white woman's journey of self-discovery, while downplaying the real suffering of those who could not or would not pass. James faced different challenges in his Atlanta congregation. The revelation about his ancestors' first family sparked strong debate about forgiveness, privilege, and family loyalty. Some church members felt Antoine had been a victim who made an impossible choice. Others felt he had enabled his wife's abandonment of their community, and that later, generations had benefited from that abandonment. James's son David added the family story to his high school history curriculum, using it to teach about the one-drop rule, passing, and the building of racial categories. But this too became controversial when some parents complained that the curriculum made white students feel guilty about their ancestors' choices. The wider public response to Dr. Crown Walsh's research and the following media coverage went from fascination to anger. Genealogy forums debated the ethics of revealing family secrets. Academic journals published different views on whether Walsh had the right to reveal information that could hurt living people. Descendants from other families who had passed contacted Walsh, both asking for help and demanding she stop sharing these stories. The Dubois photograph, once an unknown item in an estate sale box, had become a flashpoint for debates about race, identity, history, and who decides which truths should be revealed. Antoine and Celeste, frozen in their 1889 portrait, had no idea their choice would still cause pain 135 years later. As of February 2025, the legacy of the Dubois family photograph remains complex and not fully settled. Margaret Beaumont and James Mitchell have kept in touch, meeting several times and building what Margaret describes as a careful family bond. They've connected their extended families. Margaret has 12 living relatives descended from Celeste. James has 17 descended from Antoine. Not all of these relatives wanted to join the reunion. Some of Margaret's relatives refused to accept the African heritage. Some of James's relatives felt the Beaumont-Whitmore descendants had no right to suddenly claim family ties after generations of benefiting from whiteness. Dr. Rebecca Walsh's research grew into a book, Hidden in Plain Sight, Families Who Crossed the Color Line, published in fall 2024. The book documents not just the Dubois family, but 17 other similar cases she found through later research. Her work has been praised for shining light on a little-known part of American racial history, and criticized for possibly exposing families who preferred their secrets stay hidden. The original 1889 photograph now sits in the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, donated jointly by Margaret and James. It is displayed alongside the enhanced versions showing the hidden messages, with explanatory text describing how one family portrait illustrates the impossible choices faced by mixed-race families during the Jim Crow era. The property in New Orleans' Treme neighborhood that once belonged to Antoine Dubois still stands. James Mitchell visited it in 2024, standing outside the building where his great-great-grandfather had once lived with his first family. A historical marker now identifies it as the Dubois family property, site of family separation, 1889. Perhaps most important, the discovery has led both families to rethink their histories and identities. Margaret Beaumont now identifies as a mixed-race woman and has become an advocate for recognizing the descendants of those who passed as a distinct group within discussions of racial justice. James Mitchell has expanded his ministry to focus on healing racial divisions and acknowledging complex family histories. The descendants face an ongoing question. What do they owe to Antoine and Celeste's memory? Should they honor the choice to separate, recognizing it was made under impossible circumstances, or should they reject it,